designer. I've been with Winona State since 2014, helping to support our online faculty and working with different online programs. Also helped with some professional development for the Min-State system, helping to support our online instructors. I'm also a Quality Matters Master Reviewer. And Quality Matters, if you're not familiar, is a nationally online quality assurance program, which has developed a set of standards focused on quality online education. And I teach online, I have taught face-to-face, and I teach online and blended. And currently my day-to-day job is I work for Amazon as an instructional designer. But I'm lucky enough that I get to continue to work with Winona State and do some consulting and things like this. So looking at our agenda today, this session we're going to discuss online learning and elements that create that quality experience for our students. The first portion of the session is going to be a high-level look at different delivery methods, focusing on some foundational course design principles, virtual meeting engagement, and then a discussion about authentic online assessments. And we're going to examine some strategies and best practices, and I'll try to highlight some real examples. One thing to note, a lot of these examples and things are coming from mostly higher education courses, but the principles and the kind of practices are things that can be applied to a variety of different levels. And so the other thing to just remember is it's a lot to cover, but hopefully this will provide kind of that high level look or introduction to these different concepts and spark some ideas for your own content and how you might approach your own online course design delivery. And then the second portion, as Carrie mentioned, we will have an open discussion, and we're hoping to learn a little bit about your experiences with online, especially with COVID, potentially moving very quickly from a face-to-face to an online or blended format. And so we'll provide some discussion prompts at the end of the session and hopefully get some mics open. All right, so quickly touching on delivery, and I'm just kind of curious with this population and kind of see where everybody is at with their own delivery. So in the world of online learning, there are lots of different delivery options and formats, and you've probably heard a lot of different terminology kind of thrown around. I know depending on the institution, the organization that you're talking to, a lot of times the terminology can be used interchangeably, things like blended, hybrid, synchronous, asynchronous, all these different components into one. But traditionally, in general, when it comes to online education, a course is coded specifically in a way that allows the learner to know what type of delivery they're participating in. So for example, perhaps it's coded as a blended course with face-to-face components, meaning that students are going to complete material and a portion of the activities asynchronously, so kind of independently online, but then they're also required to come face-to-face for synchronous components. And both of the online and the synchronous components should be designed in a way that they're supporting one another and that really both of those components become the classroom for students. So now adding in COVID, I think a lot of the lines have got a little blurred. We've had to move very quickly. There's sort of different formats that maybe weren't traditionally coded. And so just kind of curious to get an understanding of your current situation. So if you look at the screen and the list there, in the chat, if you want to just put an A, B, C, D, or E, which kind of best describes your current teaching situation. So I'll just quickly run through the options. So fully online, meaning students are moving through materials asynchronously on their own. You're having no face-to-face or virtual components with your students. B would be fully online, but having synchronous components. So maybe you have online content, but then you're also meeting with them virtually at different points throughout the week. C would be blended with face-to-face components, so online components, and then also having some scheduled in-person face-to-face meetings. D would be kind of all the above. You're having virtual meetings, you're having online content, and you're meeting with them face-to-face. And then E, in case there's anything that I haven't covered. So if you want to just quickly in the chat, put the letter, not the number that best indicates where you're kind of at. And this will help give me an idea. Okay, so lots of D's, A and C. Great, perfect. Well, that's really helpful to kind of know where you're at. So you're really focusing on all of the components together, which can be challenging to blend them in a way that really creates that kind of cohesive piece for your students. But just know as I go through the different examples and things today, when I refer to online learning, really I'm referring to all of these experiences above. So all of these different delivery types are kind of encompassed in that online learning experience. So next, I want to touch on just some general design principles for online course design, really sort of putting on like your instructional design hat and looking at a course from not only that teacher perspective, but also that design perspective. So one of the concerns that I often hear from faculty that I work with and instructors that I work with, and I know I definitely felt like this when I started teaching online. My background is in K through 12 education. So looking at an online class was a little foreign at first for me. And one of the concerns that I would get from instructors and I was feeling personally is that students are going to feel disconnected, they're going to feel isolated. And so, one of the things that I've really found with online and blended instructors is the need to be really intentional about creating that sense of community and also that presence in their course. That students should, it should be really clear to students that someone's leading that experience, and so not only felt in your face-to-face components, but also that you're guiding them in the online components through the design of your materials and the design of that course. So when approaching designing an online course, I encourage you to think about not only the design and but also the delivery, and to kind of differentiate the two. The delivery is all the interactions that you're having in your course when it's live. So it's the discussions that you're having with students, face to face, virtual, maybe on an online discussion board. It's the feedback you're providing, it's the open questions that you're having. Basically, it's the teaching of that class. And the design is all of the planning and the forethought that takes place before that class goes live. And that is really that instructional design piece. So when it comes to designing the different elements of an online course, I find the approach is fairly similar to a face-to-face course. In general, you're going to start with a course map and start mapping out the different components, ensuring that all those elements are aligned. And all of those course elements, as we know, should start to directly support the achievement of the learning objectives. And where I see major issues with online courses is when the alignment gets out of whack. You kind of find courses that are really fragmented. Students are receiving mixed messages on what they should be focusing on. You're getting a lot of questions, a lot of emails of what do I do next, questions about busy work. And so keeping that principle of alignment really becomes your foundation for all the decisions in your course, including the learning objectives, the assessments, the materials, which technology to select, and then the interaction. I find with online courses and online course design that I have to be much more organized and a little bit more explicit about my design and sharing that with students. So the reasoning for these different elements and how they all really work together in that online environment. One thing to think about with the interactions, and I find this framework really helpful when approaching this online. I'd mentioned quality matters earlier in my introduction. And quality matters really defines three different types of engagement in online classes. And so the first is that learner to learner. What opportunities do students have to interact with one another? This could be through group work. This could be through discussion boards or virtual meetings. Maybe it's them working on shared documents together, or sorry, if you can hear my baby in the background crying. Sorry about that. It might be learner to instructor is the next kind of category. And so thinking about what is your interaction going to be with those students through feedback, discussion boards, one-on-one meetings, virtual meetings. And then learner to content is how they're going to engage with the material. So where we see some like really troublesome online courses is where the only engagement that a student has with content is reading a textbook. That would be kind of a red flag to me. But thinking about how they're going to move through the materials, the different readings that you're selecting, the recorded lectures, maybe it's interactive activities, kind of self-paced mini activities. that they have that opportunity to check their progress as they move through the materials. And so as you start to design your assignments and you start to select technology, starting to think about these three different types of interaction and what that might look like in the online content, and then what that might look like in your blended face-to-face or virtual components. So one method that is really useful for designing an online course and checking for alignment is simply to use a course map. There are lots of different course maps out there. You've probably used several when planning your own classes, but I really do use the same approach for online, and just using a simple table like this, as long as I'm including really the three main components to focus on for the alignment of the course. So those are having your objectives clearly stated, specifically what students will be able to know or do when they finish that course at that kind of course level, and then breaking it down at that weekly or module level. And then listing the activities, which are going to be the experiences that students will engage in to prepare them to meet that intended objective. So again, these are the readings, the lectures, the websites, the practice activities, the group discussions that they're having. And then assessments are that evidence of that student learning. So what am I going to use? What evidence do I have to make that judgment? And mapping out these different elements, I find to be really helpful to kind of show that holistic view. I do share my course maps with my students so that they can see the connection between these other items. I also think, especially during these times, that sharing this with parents can be really, really helpful, especially as they're helping students navigate materials for some of those younger audiences. And so having this course map and being very explicit and open with your course design, I find can help not only students, but then also parents with the facilitation of moving through those items. When you are approaching the design, it really helps to create a framework that students can navigate through. And so one of the first things to ask yourself looking at your content is, does it make sense to divide it by a structure, maybe with modules or units or parts, whatever kind of terminology makes sense? Or does it make sense to maybe divide your materials by weeks? There's not a right or wrong. I always get asked that, is there a right or wrong? There's not. It really depends on your structure and what kind of makes sense with the natural order of your content. One way to kind of think about it is, maybe your topics are more self-contained. And so creating modules or units that students move through that have varying timelines. So maybe one module takes 1 week and then the next one takes 2 weeks to move through, versus a week structure where maybe your topics are kind of all over the place and really you want to use that timeline of weeks to move through the content. And so looking at what this might look like in an LMS, and when I say LMS, that stands for Learning Management System. You might be using something like D2L or Moodle or Schoology, depending on your school and what you have available. But using a kind of hub or a learning management system can be helpful to guide your learners from one item to the next. And so this is a really sort of simple example of a design using D2L. And if you look over at the table of contents, you can see that the materials and activities are grouped by week. And then when you click on one of those weeks, within there are 2 sub-modules, one for the content that's going to be completed online and one for the content that's going to be completed face-to-face. And so this is just a really simplistic design, but by simply grouping these items together and including all the materials, all the assessments, all the resources, instructions that a student would need for that particular week in that section helps simplify the navigation for students. And so comparing it to creating one folder and putting all of your assignment instructions in there, and then creating another folder and putting all of the readings for the entire class in there. Breaking it apart and creating this linear structure for students helps them focus on the specific items, and it also helps with that general navigation. Here's another example just using parts. Again, thinking about what terminology makes sense for you. You can see this example here that it's divided by parts. And then within those sub-modules are the different chapters. And then in this case, there was a face-to-face session as well. So a student would navigate through all the materials for chapter 1, navigate through all the materials for chapter 2, and then they would also have all of the materials needed for a face-to-face session as well. Some general tips and kind of things to think about as you approach that structure. And again, we all have different limitations depending on the technology that we have, but these are sort of general tips that apply. Is again, creating some sort of structure and solid framework that your students can follow. This will help them navigate from one item to the next. The other item I would definitely recommend is being very specific with your naming conventions and consistent. It sounds really sort of tedious and not as important, but I'm telling you, nothing will get more questions than if I send an email and say, take exam 1. And then my students go to take that exam, and it's actually called quiz 1. All of a sudden, everybody is confused. There's questions. There's this uncertainty of being an online learner. And now that has increased because there's inconsistency in my messaging. So I truly create a style guide, and I literally write out what I'm going to call everything so that when I build it or I supply that quiz or write about that quiz, I'm making sure that all my naming conventions are really consistent throughout. And just a simple style guide indicating what you're going to call those things can be helpful as you start to build materials. You might use your textbook. Sometimes this is a nice way to find a structure that would work for an LMS. So if your textbook is divided by chapters, maybe you divide your modules by chapters. If your textbook uses parts, maybe that's kind of a natural naming convention to use. So don't be afraid to use some of your, major content to help shape the look of your course. And then one thing I would say is really important. Technology, of course, it's important to provide our students guides and make sure that they understand the contents, but it's also really important to provide a description of how you structured your course. So again, not only what you're providing, but how you've provided it. Oftentimes I hear from instructors, my students know how to use D2L, and they might know the functionality and the features, but they don't know how I designed my course. And the way that I use the features could be very different than the way Carrie's using the features in her course. So providing a bit of an overview or detailed video, having an onboarding opportunity for your students is really important for that online learning environment. All right, so switching gears a little bit and looking at virtual meetings, since it sounds like almost everybody is having some sort of virtual components. Lots of tools out there. I'm not going to spend time talking about tools. I think a lot of people are using Zoom, but they all function pretty similarly and have a lot of the same features. So lots of different types of virtual meetings you might be bringing in. You might be using it for class discussion. You might be using it for teaching a lesson, guest speakers. Some things that can help that meeting move a little bit more smoothly, and some tips to think about is addressing cameras. Do you want to have cameras on? It's great to have on to build community. You can see each other and keep that attention. I will say that if students are having any kind of bandwidth issues, cameras are the first thing to turn off. That can be helpful. And sometimes in my own virtual meetings, I'll just have my students turn on their camera if they're actively presenting, if they're having issues with bandwidth. The other thing that's really helpful is to provide an agenda, starting each session with a clear agenda of what they're going to be covering in that particular virtual meeting. Because there are so many different types of virtual meetings now, I do think it's important to let our students know this is a working meeting, this is for group projects, this is a lecture. I'm going to be lecturing for X amount of time, and then we're going to move into a breakout activity. And setting those expectations at the beginning of the class can be really helpful. Sharing your screen, having all the items kind of queued up on your laptop ready to go. So before I start a presentation, I will open all the tabs that I need so that I can simply share from one item to the next. That can help with saving time. When possible, I always try to record, and then you can share that link with students that might have missed that live virtual piece. They can go back and rewatch it. I've had guest lecturers come in and, maybe everybody's not able to come in, but I still want to share that with the other students. One tip is if you are having recordings is to restate questions that are put in the chat. Sometimes for various reasons, they might not be watching the chat at the same time as the recording. And so if I see a question in the chat, I'll say, oh, hey, Carrie asked a question about X, Y, and Z, so that that's captured in the recording. Kind of think of yourself as like an MC. You're sort of the, the spokesperson for the virtual meeting. And then the environment, making sure you have a quiet space. As I say that as my baby was screaming in the background. But trying to have a quiet space with a quiet background, and sharing that with your students as well, so that they start having some best practices for participating in class. The other thing to think about is engagement. And so there's so many ways to engage your students. This is just a really quick list of things to think about. But you might have your students take on different roles. And so if I'm in a meeting where there are a lot of people, I will sometimes assign a student to be in charge of monitoring the chat for me. And they'll be the one collecting the questions or looking at the responses and saying, hey, you know, we had this many people say D in the chat, or there's a couple more questions here on this particular topic. So use your students to facilitate some of that. You don't have to take on all of the ownership of those pieces. You might have your students host meetings, working with students where they not only are taking on a leadership role, but also gaining some skills for virtual facilitation. I think virtual meetings are here to stay. And so having students be comfortable in not only participating, but hosting can be a nice technique. Asking questions in different formats. We do this all the time in our face-to-face classes, equally as effective online. So, you know, sometimes I might put a question in the chat and have students respond. Sometimes I might have an open-ended question, say, anybody have a response, raise your hand. Sometimes I might call on a particular student. Changing that up throughout the meeting can keep the focus and engagement going. And help people, you know, stay checked in. I know we're always worried about students doing something else or not focusing on that lesson. Using the features within the tool. So if you're using Zoom, using raise hands, using the annotation feature, I would recommend, if you're using the annotation feature, is to actually build in a slide into your slide deck specifically for the annotations. And so you might have a slide that students are encouraged to mark up or put X's next to the one they like, or underline, you know, the correct verb in the sentence, things like that. And then you can also turn that feature off in Zoom as well. So you can restrict the annotation access. Using informal polls, just like I did in the chat, you know, A, B, C, or D on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you with this topic? That's a great way to get the pulse of the room really quickly. And then you might use the actual built-in poll feature, which I'm sure all of you have maybe explored, but some nice options for building polls before your session, displaying them during the live session, and then talking about that data together as a group, to really, you know, bring the conversation and have it a bit of a conversation starter by using those features. Okay, so last item, and I know this is rapid fire. So again, high level look, but maybe the next thing you'd kind of be thinking about or looking at is your online assessments. And this is always a hot topic with online. With online, I would say within a course, it's extremely important to have a balance of formative assessment and summative assessment. And especially online, I find it to be even more important, because in my face-to-face class, I can look around the room. We obviously can see if students are confused or missing something. I don't always have that advantage online. Students are often working independently through items or working through course content independently. And so it becomes even more important to be strategic and build in those checkpoints and practice opportunities for students, so that you can identify if there's an issue early on. And then also students have an opportunity to practice those skills before they get to that high level summative assessment. So some really just simple techniques that you might use, one being a muddiest point discussion board. This just basically means a discussion board dedicated each week or each module, where students post what's one thing that they're confused about. Based on the content this week, what's their muddiest point? And what you can do with those muddiest points is either respond, or you might take that information and have that drive your lecture or drive your conversation in your virtual meetings or face-to-face meetings. Having them complete that online so that you have an idea of some of those concerns or areas that they're confused about can help drive your delivery when you are together. Having low stakes discussion boards, multiple opportunities for papers and drafts and things like that. Moving online, there's a lot of opportunity for some publisher material and interactive lessons. Oftentimes, if you are working with a publisher, they might have some ready to go content that you can plug and play that will give students immediate feedback, so they can see right away if they're getting things right or wrong, or doing just simple concept maps. All those techniques that we often do face-to-face can be moved online and submitted. Some examples of things that you might pair with your recorded lectures, if you are using any sort of recorded content or video content, is you might develop a gap notes worksheet to go along with that recorded lecture. And so simply creating a worksheet that has some very strategic items that are missing, that students can fill in while they're watching that video. So they can go back, they can rewatch that video as many times as they need to, and they can fill in that worksheet and turn that in for points. Same can be said with a worksheet or a diagram, oftentimes sort of pausing in your recording, prompting students to go to that worksheet to complete the diagram or the table. You might pair a low stakes self-assessment or a quiz with that recorded lecture, pulling out key points. I like to do this with my recorded lectures just to make sure that they're watching them. And what I'll do is I will change the settings on the quiz tool so that they can take it twice, but it's an average. So they can't just go through it and bomb it. They have to, go through it twice and then they get an average of their scores. Or you might use a tool like VoiceThread. And if you're not familiar with VoiceThread, it is a tool where you can create recorded material and then students can leave voice responses. So you might have a prompt at the end of a section where students would leave comments or questions right within that recording itself. So exploring some different technology and tools like that. An example of maybe a high stakes assessment that you could bring into your class is video presentations. And I would argue that having students record video presentations and turn them in online can be a great strategy even for fully face-to-face classes, because it saves time. I think a lot of times, sometimes our presentations can take up a lot of face-to-face class time, especially with the current situation. That face-to-face or virtual component is so important, that if we can move a presentation component online, have students record them and watch them asynchronously on their own, then that face-to-face time can be used really for more deeper engagement. So one strategy is to have your students record a presentation, lots of different technology available. But if you are using some sort of LMS discussion board tool, you could have students embed these videos on that discussion board. And what this allows is for other students to now view those presentations and leave comments. So it does create a bit of that experience if you think in our face-to-face classes and we have students present materials and then we say, are there any questions? And they're sort of in the hot seat to answer those questions. The same could be done using this type of activity just in an asynchronous format. So they would have to go to that discussion board, answer any questions from their peers about their presentation. The other thing I like about moving presentations onto a discussion board is, again, it helps them develop some of those skills for presenting in a different format. And so presenting live face-to-face to our classmates is a very different experience than taking the time, curating, and creating a very professional video presentation. And so this might be an opportunity to bring in some of those skills. I just want to highlight one last example of an assignment that you might think about for online discussion boards or forums. And I just wanted to highlight this one because I think when we think discussion boards, we always think discussion prompt, response. And there's lots of different ways that you can use that communication tool and structure it a little bit different to still have that authentic assessment for our students. And so this example is called an agree-disagree discussion board. And basically students do 3 posts. And the way it's set up is you select a topic where there's 2 perspectives, something they could agree on or disagree on. And then the first post is students have to select their stance and provide examples or evidence to support that stance. So it's different than just a poll and finding out what students think. They really have to create a post and include some concrete examples and evidence to support that stance. So that's post one. They decide what they think. Post two is they review and respond at least two other opposing stances, and they ask a challenging question. So they would post what they think, then they go to the opposing view and they ask them a challenging question. And then the last post is determining, did they change their opinion after reading the other statements? So they've had an opportunity to make an opinion, support that opinion, ask a question, and then they have to determine, did they change their opinion? So this is what it kind of looks like in an LMS. Again, this is D2L, but this is just a simple discussion board. And this example was coming from a case study looking at social media, and it was basically debating whether this person should have been fired or not fired based on the scenario. So for the agree disagree discussion board, first the students would determine if they want to post in the don't fire or should have been fired. Then they would go to the opposite one. So if I decided that the person should have been fired, I would make my post there, and then I would go to the opposite section and ask a challenging question from someone there. And then everybody post in the did you change your mind? This is a quick activity. It's something students can do asynchronously. It requires them to gather evidence and support their opinions. And it's a really great way to gather some quick information about your class. I worked with a faculty member who did this at the start of every single module. So would introduce a topic, and this was the way to get the conversation going as they moved into the content for that particular area. So that again is a really, really quick high look at some online principles and concepts and assessments, thinking of it sort of from that instructional design perspective. But I want, and it looks like good, we have some time left. I'm going to grab this link and I'm going to put this in the chat. And this is a survey that Carrie has developed. And if, there we go, put it in the link. If you want to go ahead and click on that link and feel free to start completing it as we're talking and discussing some of these items. Or if you want to save it till after the session, that's perfectly fine. But we're hoping to kind of gather some information about your personal experiences when it comes to online. What are some of your challenges? What have been some positives or surprises that you've had? Where do you kind of see online going? What's your outlook for it and how it relates to your classes? So I'm going to go ahead and take a pause here, and I'm going to open up with, maybe I'm going to jump down to challenges and hopefully get some mics opened up here and have a bit of a discussion. Feel free if you want to put it in the chat, but otherwise, does anyone have some challenges that you've faced or things that you've encountered as you've moved to your face-to-face, online, virtual delivery with those components happening all at once? Any specific challenges that you've faced? And we're a small group, so feel free just to open up your mic.
I think just trying to reach the, I don't know, I would call it maybe 10-15% of students that just aren't engaging really very much at all for distance learning.
So when you say not engaging at all, is that happening in your virtual rooms? Is it happening that they're not completing the online content? Where are you kind of seeing that lack of engagement?
A little bit of both. I guess when we're doing, during synchronous learning, I mean, it's the same students that are struggling both ways, I guess. If it's synchronous, they're almost, I mean, they're there, but not at all following. Or, I've got a couple students that'll show up, they'll stick on for about 10 minutes and then they log off. And we were still having class and they just were out. And then they're not getting work done, and it's just a struggle to keep up with them when we're not seeing them on a daily basis.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's just accountability in general and some of those sort of accountability, but also maybe some skills for being a successful online student.
Yeah, when they're live, you can at least keep up with them on a regular basis, and you can you see them and can personally engage with them every day, and it's just not as possible this way.
Definitely. Any other challenges anyone's encountered?
I'm kind of seeing that same challenge. I have some students that would struggle being in class every day, and then with seeing them every other day, you know, like John said, I had some in class today, they left after 10 minutes and we weren't even close to being done. But it's hard to keep tabs of them. It's not like you can call them back into class. Um, so that's kind of what I'm struggling with right now with one of my classes.
Definitely. Are you currently, is there any kind of tracking that you're doing, like attendance in general, but any kind of tracking that's either happening in the online content or any kind of piece with that?
Um, we take attendance for my classes, but I don't know how much that really means a lot. To be honest, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the natural consequences aren't really effective. I guess the kid failing a class or whatever isn't going to help. It doesn't seem to like motivate them to not avoid class.
Yep. No, I hear you.
And by the time they leave, it's hard to track their online, work because they haven't been there to even receive an assignment to know what they should be working on, or, to receive the instruction piece of it.
Hmm. How about
Mary,
on the opposite side? Any kind of surprises or positives that you've seen moving to online that you didn't anticipate?
Mary got a question. I have some videos that I have that I want students to watch out on D2L,
Hmm.
for the different sections that are covered. Is there a way to track to see who has watched those videos?
Yes-ish. And I say that because within D2L, there's a functionality where you can see which students clicked on the content. And so you can see the progress and you'll get a list of everybody who clicked on that item and everybody who has not clicked on it. Now, depending on how your videos are recorded and shared within D2L, you might be able to get some additional analytics. So are you recording your videos and storing them in something like MediaSpace and then linking them in D2L?
Right, that's what we're doing. Yep.
Perfect. So through MediaSpace, you should be able to grab the analytics of, uh, it actually breaks it down pretty extensively. You can see how long they watched, you can see drop off. And so if you go into MediaSpace, you can collect some of that information. But within D2L in general, if you've ever looked at I think it's still called user progress or class progress, you can get a breakdown for every single piece of content in the class, what a student has clicked on and how long they've clicked on that particular item. And I really enjoy that feature for especially intervention, like the things you're talking about, is if I get an assignment and it's totally odd, I will immediately go to that student's user progress and see if they even clicked on my assignment instructions. And so that can help you sort of make some informed decisions and have conversations with students. Yeah, and I can't remember, I think it's class progress or user progress, but it should be under the assessment tab.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So any successes, any kind of things that were surprising or positive, maybe opening up some opportunities or forced to use some technology that maybe you weren't expecting to use? No positives. That's discouraging. Hate to hear that as an instructional designer. And I see in the chat, Caitlin says, I'm a kindergarten teacher and I'm struggling keeping their attention and not being just another video they have to sit through. It's hard to make online calls interactive. Oh my gosh, I feel for you, Caitlin. I cannot imagine. I have a hard enough time with adults. Yeah, so I think in general with that, like a strategy, and it's not like a very complicated strategy, but being very planned in your interaction and having a very clear agenda can be helpful for video content or virtual meetings so that you do have very specific amounts of time that you're asking them to engage with content and then switching to an interactive activity. So online, maybe that looks like some quick little kind of fun interactive flashcards, and then they're moving to a short video. I think when it comes to younger audiences, attention span is important, and having a very clear cut calculated plan can help us move them from one piece of content to the next. It's definitely a little bit more work, I think, from the instructor standpoint, but knowing that that's going to be a challenge with that audience is something to definitely look at. But I feel for you. Attention of kindergartners, that's got to be hard. Any other items, or as we're kind of nearing the end, just comments in general with the online experience? Do you see this being something that's going to stay in your school district? Something that maybe your school is embracing for the future moving forward? Kind of any in general comments about online education in your current situation? Oh, I like that, Caitlin. A positive. Parent-teacher conferences on Zoom were way easier than in person. I could definitely see that. In general, with online, one of the things that I like about it is it breaks down barriers. And so sometimes physically getting to that classroom might be a barrier for a parent. And so having an opportunity to still be able to do that online and still have that conversation, I could definitely see that. That's a great one. All parents attended. That's awesome. That like never happens. Any other comments?
Well, I think a positive thing is that, if you're in class, let's say you do face-to-face and you give a lecture and they don't catch something. Well, if you have a video of it, they can go back, stop it and rewind it and listen to it again, rather than taking notes all the time very quickly. They can stop and think about things.
That's such a good point. I think I know personally in my teaching, video has opened up so many opportunities. I have taken it a step further where I even will record some of my feedback. So a face-to-face conversation that I might have with a student where we talk through a paper, instead of doing that, I might record my feedback looking at their paper and provide them that evidence so they can do exactly like you said, go back, rewatch it, remember what I said, remember how I said it, and use that as they make improvements on their next assignment. So yeah, I think video is a great way for us to capture information, repurpose it and repackage it, and then have students engage with it in a different way. Michelle said, I've been pulled in many directions in class, having to face-to-face students and online at the same time. Oh my gosh, yes. I think this has to be extremely challenging. I've had a couple classes where I've had to engage multiple audiences, and it's a little overwhelming. Again, I kind of am going back to the having a very clear plan and thinking about when it comes to engagement and activities, how to get those virtual students to engage with one another. I think having a really clear plan for group work and who are they going to be working with, depending on the space that you have available, can you have some students take a device and have a couple students in person engage with one person online, and differentiate those different groups for students in ways that they can not have to sit passively, but be a part of the conversation, and dedicating some specific time during the class for that can be really helpful. yeah, definitely challenging. Any other last minute comments? I know we're kind of running down on time, but any other kind of comments, concerns, areas that you're hoping to focus on, areas in your own professional development? It's always kind of a continuous process with online. There's so many different elements to focus on and look at. Anything that we want to close with? Any last minute comments? All right, well, if there aren't any last minute comments, then I'm going to hand it off to Carrie. And thank you so much for having me, Carrie. This was fun. I always like talking about online learning. And I especially enjoy liking to talk with K through 12 instructors. It's kind of a spot that I really like to talk about education, and things are changing, and these are difficult times, and there's so many challenges that I think it's helpful for us to talk about them together, share best practices, and think about different strategies that we can support students.